We're about to get started with our afternoon panel on legal updates. And Victoria is our moderator. Would you please give her your full attention? Thank you.
Thanks, Beverly. Like I said, I'm Victoria Hazlett. I work for the City of Austin in the City Attorney's Office. And I'm joined by Patrick Banis, who works for HUD in the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. Brian Snoddy, who is the Director of the Civil Rights Division for the Texas Workforce Commission. And our wonderful keynote speaker is back up here, Reed Colfax, to answer just some questions and have some discussion about legal updates in fair housing. And so we have a couple of questions, some open-ended questions for you all, but if you would want to start maybe over there with Brian and just tell us a little bit about what you do, and we'll go from there.
My name is Brian Snoddy, and I'm the director for Texas Workforce Commission Civil Rights Division. We do have both a FEPA and a FAP. We have about 56 FTEs that work in our organization, and I've been director for about 4.5 years. We handle probably about 24,000 inquiries a year total, so we're quite busy. So that keeps me busy, and we try to make sure we work really well with our EEOC and our HUD partners. I'll pass the mic.
Patrick Banis, I'm the Region 6 Enforcement Center Director. Can y'all hear me? Okay, that's probably too far away. We cover our 5-state region, so it's Texas. Okay. Yeah, let's try that. Okay, let's try this again. Patrick Banis, I'm the Region 6 Enforcement Center Director for HUD. We cover our 5-state region. It's Texas, everything that touches it. It's pretty complicated, some of the stuff we do. It's not just the 5th Circuit, but the 10th and the 11th, and trying to sort out sometimes just the differences in case law can be pretty challenging. Don't quite have the volume that TWC has. I guess that's a combination of employment and housing. But roughly about 5,000 complaints are filed through our office every year, and about 25% of those result in cases that are accepted for investigation.
I'm Reed Colfax from the law firm Relman Colfax, based out of Washington, D.C. I happen to have made the wise choice to get out of D.C. and move to Santa Fe, New Mexico about 20 years ago, and have been working remotely from Santa Fe ever since then. So I've actually done a lot of work in Texas. We've had a lot of cases with the Texas Workforce Commission, with Sandra. We've done a lot of cases together, and Francis up in Dallas. So frequently done a lot of housing discrimination cases in the area.
Okay, great. So we'll start with our first question, and that is about recent changes or updates to fair housing laws. Which of those do you think have had the biggest impact on individuals and communities? Anybody want to start?
Okay, I'll start. Well, one of the things I think is important is that we should probably lay out. Well, are we live? There we go. Yeah, one of the things I'd start with is one of the things I noted, and I told Reed I'd talk about this a tad bit, but when we're talking about the changes in the law and the systems, whether it was nefarious, whether it's by indifference, or whether it's even with good intentions, the law has, and the system that are here in America are systematic. They have been systematically not good for those that have been those of color, for those that come from slavery, for those that have immigrated, for those that have disabilities. And in fact, in the 1930s, I think it was the federal government, in one attempt to help, they had what they called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And they actually went through the process of developing a color-coordinated map right after the war, because they were trying to help people figure out what mortgage risk was. Now, no need to tell you that, but that mortgage risk map it coordinated directly to some of the zones we see in Houston, some of the 5th, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Ward or Acres Homes, or it's coordinated to different sides of the tracks, the railroads. And so what we've seen here is this is not just something that happened by happenstance. This is a systemic issue, a systemic problem that has been built, one, from the beginning of the country, but also has been magnified by policies and choices that have been made. So one of the things that we want to make sure we're doing is, if you're going to work on a systemic problem, you've got to have a systemic response. And so I did say that what we talk about here is we do have a law, it's our Enabling Act, which is a Chapter 301 of the Texas Property Code. And so we're going to begin to make some, or at least make some suggestions for changes in that. Now to write the notes down here for myself. Part of that's going to be on clarifying the structure itself. We want to make sure that folks know that we're no longer with the Texas Human Rights Commission, but that we're under the Texas Workforce Commission. That does have some benefits. We have the Texas Workforce Commission is about 5,000 strong. With the other workforce development partner boards, it's about another 13,000 people. So it's a huge agency enterprise. And we know, looking at our data, enterprise data warehouse, that there's a very tight connection between being employed, being able to sustain a healthy family outset, and maintain a good home outcome. The other things we're looking at are besides being fully integrated with TWC, we want to make sure that we have full enforcement of our conciliations. Presently, our law limits that to the complainant. So somebody engaged in a conciliation, only the complainant can bring that back. But we also recognize that some of the folks many of the folks we represent or that come to us, they don't have the ability to go to court to enforce their conciliation. So we want to see if the legislature may entertain that sort of a change in the law. In addition to that, being a proud homeowner, I'm in an HOA like many others are when you buy a home. One of the things we recognize also as well is that a lot of the times the developers build a home, they put the homeowners in charge, but when they hand it off, many of the homeowners have no technical assistance or training. They have no understanding of any of the fair housing laws whatsoever. So we end up with situations where their disability, mobility, personal issues, those things, the reasonable accommodations and the things that need to be done are not done. The fair housing issues are mishandled. And so we do want to suggest and provide training for those that are HOAs.
Make sure it wasn't turned off. I was going to talk a little bit about PAVE, but it's been talked about quite a bit. The one thing I will say, kind of touching on what we've talked about earlier and what Brian's brought up about the systemic, is the PAVE is a resource. You can look at a lot of data, and one of the things that will jump out you is, even though you can show that the values of homes for Latinx and Black communities are going up, there's still this disparity in value. And so there's still a lot of ground to be made up. And a lot of that traces back to the historical discrimination. Roughly 100 years ago, we've got these color-coded maps that are telling us where to lend, where not to lend, where the risks are, where you might be able to lend, but maybe not. And so we've got a long ways to go in order to unravel that part of it. Probably something notable that HUD did here in this region is about a year ago, we issued a letter of finding against a housing provider in Oklahoma, where we had some severe race-based harassment in a really small community, but at a HUD-funded property, where a white tenant was dating a Black man, and the other white tenants had taken exception to it. And we were able to, through that investigation, tie the harassment to the landlord or the management company, basically. And while that would sound easy, it's actually a little bit more difficult than we thought it would be. So the fact that we were able to get to that point and take that position was pretty notable.
I think I've got my lapel mic here, so I'm good on that. Let me talk about something that's coming. And the thing that's coming is this concept that we as a society can only operate in a colorblind way when it benefits the ruling white folks that run the country. There is a trend right now of interpreting the Equal Protection Clause and anti-discrimination statutes as not allowing anything affirmative for the people who have been discriminated against for centuries. So you look at affirmative action getting knocked down in higher education. There's a recent case called the Fearless Fund out of Florida, where there was a group that was giving venture capital opportunities to Black women. That has gotten challenged and so far has lost. And there is a premise behind all of these cases is that you cannot consider race when benefiting people of color. Of course, we've considered race in this country since 1619, but all of a sudden, it's no longer permissible. And it's just not, and it's not true in terms of how our laws are designed. So the 14th Amendment is the real driver of this theory. And the 14th Amendment was a remedial statute. It was not a statute of colorblindness. So with the 14th Amendment came the Freedmen Bureau's Act, right, which gave money. It was like the concept of 40 acres and a mule. It happened at the same time in the Freedmen's Bureau, right, with the banks and other opportunities for formerly enslaved folks. But now these originalists, right, the people who say, oh, we have to look at the Constitution as it was written at the time and what the original framers meant, just conveniently ignore what was going on when these statutes of equality were passed. The next thing that is going to be on the chopping block, right, two things are going to happen at the same time. Right, so HUD is working on an affirmatively furthering rule, right, to strengthen all of our abilities to affirmatively further Fair Housing Act, right, take active actions to promote fair housing. That's going to run into the same concept that affirmative action has run into, the Fearless Fund has run into, that you can't do anything affirmative and consider race, and everything else is going to be right, but gender, any characteristic. So that's the thing to keep our eyes out for, and what I think over the next 10, 15 years is going to have the biggest impact on communities of color. We're barely doing it now, anything affirmative, but if it's completely stopped and against the law, it's going to just totally dry up.
I think it's like a double shot too, because the antipathy to the disparate impact theory that we're seeing in the Fifth Circuit, and then also with the Supremes, and so it's basically a double punch, right? And so it makes it incredibly more difficult for us to push forward things that we feel are wrong, and so forcing us to kind of go back to the drawing board and figure out how are we going to push forward.
I forgot to give my disclaimer. One, Patrick said I could say anything I wanted to say up here, and then two, I'm not going to say anything on behalf of TWC, which does give me more latitude. And so I'd say this. First off, we're in one of those everything, everywhere, all at once moments. If you're watching this Supreme Court, if you're watching this Fifth Circuit, and I don't think I need to mention the cases, but for those that have had maybe a bit of classical education in law, or you just watch law on TV, the law right here is not enough. The law will not save us. This is in fact a moment where we're going to have to rally many different things together in terms of coordinating efforts, of utilizing various systematic processes to attack a system that has been in place for a very long time. So, because you can't take something that's happened systematically and not have a systematic response that's strategic in response to that. You will not be successful. And so what we're looking at here is some degree, and I think to a large degree, a rollback on the rights that many Americans have come to rely upon and have been advanced. But we cannot sit on our laurels and expect that those are going to be maintained. We see that with many of the decisions that have come from these various courts.
Okay, and so that actually leads into one of our questions that was further down the line, but I think it's a good place to go, is how are you and other stakeholders within the communities collaborating to address these systemic issues of discrimination? And, you know, you talked about needing systemic change to these issues. And so have you seen, any of you seen, you know, effective strategies in promoting and protecting fair housing rights? Maybe things that haven't gone well, but how are you working with other stakeholders to try and get through this?
That's a great question. I'll tell you, part of what we do is the Civil Rights Division. We do have a statute that says that we're a neutral third party, that we have to be fair and fair arbiters, and we handle things without fear or favor. So we want to do that, but at the same time, we also recognize that within the state of Texas, and this is where the benefit of sort of being under the larger umbrella of Texas Workforce Commission, there are 10 million households. There are 16 million people in the civilian workforce population. If I ran the numbers, I think we have about 60, a little less than 60 people in our organization, but if you took all of the numbers of everybody that was in HUD and in EEOC across the entire country, I guess we don't have maybe 10,000 or so, not a huge number. Not nearly enough to actually provide the services in response to the stakeholders and those that are out there. So one of the first things we've done is we've looked out there and said, where are the needs for our customers and our stakeholders? And when we identify a need, in the past, I think the initial point of recognition was, we're going to go out and try to actually provide services. What we've recognized is we're quickly overmatched by the demand. Because what we're looking at is it's a system that's been around since inception. We're not going to change that by ourselves. And so we've had to go out and look for partnerships because we can get more done together than we ever could alone. So one of the first partnerships that we've had, I think, was TDHCA. I think my friend Nathan is gone, but that's the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. We work with them on cross-coordination and referral of investigations. Then we've also had a chance to connect with the TALCB, the Texas Appraisal Licensing Board, and then we've worked with them on referring matters where we saw inappropriate appraisals, or they referred appraisals to us where there may be indications of discrimination. But we've also continued to look for, and we're going to continue to source for more partners, whether that's our FIPS, do some great work in San Antonio, Greater Houston, our FAPS, our FIPAs, our various civil rights and disability organizations. Everyone, everywhere, all at once has to be involved here. This is an all of government, all of community effort. Otherwise, we can't succeed.
I think on a large scale, in terms of the federal government, the HUD, DOJ, and the EPA have had some success on environmental justice complaints. And so there's opportunities for that going forward, what I would call kind of multi-agency approaches. On a smaller scale, there's been cases where we've had success, just more kind of internal, what we used to call cylinders within HUD, but collaborating with our Office of Public and Indian Housing or our Office of Multifamily Housing, and kind of working in concert to address what can both be civil rights violations, but also be a compliance issue for a recipient, which something Reed touched on earlier, which would also bring to light some AFFH claims when we're talking about recipient cities. So there's there's going to be continued opportunity there, especially kind of with this pall that the courts have kind of put over us in terms of disparate impact, is we're going to have to really probably drill down more in terms of the compliance aspect of our work. And then, much like what TWC is struggling with, the federal government's got the same challenges. And so the number of claims that come through our door and the staff that are available to address them is always stretched pretty thin. So something that, for the advocates, and I came from the advocacy side, so Sandra can vouch for me. I'll throw her under the bus, not really, but what I would always caution the advocates is pick your best claim. Don't hit us with 30 claims and expect us to be able to tackle all 30 for you. Really kind of prioritize like the big one, the ones that you think are the most important, because we're going to have to kind of pick and choose where our resources go to, and so that will position all of us, for hopeful success in the future.
I think to a certain extent, we have, on the advocacy side, have a little bit lost control of the narrative about what's going on in fair housing. And so I think the communities that are successful are those that are really, really educated about the issues, educated about fair housing, educated about the resources and the tools that they have. And then you get things like the Fair Housing Organization, 20 of them working together and tackling national problems, and just doing things at a broader level than I think we have seen in the past. And that has led to a lot of success, but it just is a constant fight against legislatures, against judges, sometimes the federal government, sometimes the state government. And at the root of all that is the education, but then also voting. And that's the way we're going to seize the narrative back and have a narrative that thinks about advocacy and thinks about fair housing, is to get a new crop of folks running the cities, the counties, the states, and the country.
Okay, great. And so let's talk a little bit about how fair housing laws are being enforced in practice. I know in your keynote you talked a lot about disparate impact and, a broad level of how that is being enforced, but maybe a little bit more on, the Texas Fifth Circuit side, and what kind of challenges do enforcement agencies and organizations face in ensuring compliance?
I think I'll take the last part of that and focus on that a little bit. I think I don't want to let us all leave here feeling kind of beat down about the Fifth Circuit. In terms of compliance, there's probably two things that we've seen a lot of in the last year within our region. Probably the more pronounced of the two would be effective communications, which is an issue that pops up for our federal money recipients, both big and small. And that really what we're seeing a lot of is issues and not being able to adequately address the needs of our hearing impaired or our vision impaired clients. And so we're handling a lot of those issues under Section 504 of the Rehab Act, and also the ADA, and also, that kind of take a multi-authority approach to these cases. But the real driver behind it for us on those cases is Section 504 and then the ADA and Fair Housing Act. But the other issue that we're starting to encounter more in terms of a compliance issue is LEP, which stands for Limited English Proficiency. And that has a lot to do with our like our CDBG recipients or our housing authorities. So what I would call kind of like our big players, and their failures to adequately meet the needs of an ever increasing client base, meaning not just translating documents into Spanish, but maybe also having a need to provide them in like maybe Hmong or Chinese or some other languages. And so that's an involved process in terms of determining what translation services you're going to provide. But those are kind of two issues that we're seeing a lot more of and that we've been tackling.
I think from the standpoint of enforcement, one of the things we always want to look for is making sure that we're both effective and efficient. Court cases are great, but they're also rather expensive. Thankfully, HUD does provide us some additional funding, some special funding at times if we need to bring in experts. But in many cases, what we really want to try to do is to change the zeitgeist of the narrative of what's taking place. We don't want the act of the continued discrimination to occur and go on while we're engaged in lengthy, protracted litigation, if we can. So I think we had about 420-some resolutions last year, and about 80 to 90, about 25% of those were actually conciliated. And so as a part of that conciliation, we do have sort of robust mechanisms for equitable relief, for we got posting of policies, additional training, and more technical assistance. And we want to make sure that, one, we're able to address the harm where it is there, but we don't want to get behind the problem. We also want to get ahead of it as well. So we want to continue to provide that training, technical assistance, so that we're not chasing the cases and problems, but we're actually getting people on the right track ahead of time.
And focusing on the Fifth Circuit, I think from my perspective, the answer is pretty easy. It's standing, and fair housing organizations are critical to the process of getting discriminatory housing practices stopped and getting redress for people who have been harmed for them. And the Fifth Circuit is making it very, very difficult, or much more difficult, for fair housing organizations to have the standing to be able to bring those claims. So that, I think, is a significant issue. And anytime I'm on stage with a representative of HUD and a representative of the Texas Workforce Commission, I'm going to make a plea for just making it easy, right? We see on the back end as attorneys who have gotten cases that even, gone through successfully or unsuccessfully through an administrative process. Sometimes people talking about how hard the process is to get through either a state or local or the federal administrative process. And then sometimes there's some wonky decisions that come out. I always tell the story about a case I had where there was a housing provider who had a sign actually out on the sidewalk advertising apartments for rent. And it said, no kids, pets okay. The case got no caused by a FAP on a standing issue. It's like, come on. This is a clear violation of the Familial Status Protection of the Fair Housing Act. Don't make it hard, right? And so I think just I always say this is just have that perspective. Understand, right? There are rules that the FAPs and HUD have to follow, and they have to make sure the procedures are met. But at the same time, just always taking it from the perspective of the individual who just doesn't know what to do, right? I've been discriminated against. This is an avenue I see. I'm doing the best I can, making it easy as possible. So.
Okay, and so one of the questions we have is about advancements in technology and data collection, and if you think that can help identify patterns of discrimination and promote fair housing practices, if you've noticed, any use of that in the work you do currently.
Yeah, I can start. Since the pandemic, or right before the pandemic, I think it was September of 2019, and I was living up north in Wells Branch, and I didn't really want to drive into the Austin traffic. I don't know if anybody had that experience this morning, but you sort of get stuck in this traffic thing. And so I'd been under the tutelage of a young lady, Kristen Cox, out of Utah, and she talked about utilizing, we all have limited amounts of time, energy, and attention. And so what we decided very quickly was, or at least I decided was, as a director, unless I have a meeting or I have to be someplace, I'm not going to get into the Austin traffic. I just wasn't going to go. And so at that point, we were really beginning the process, I think, of what a lot of people have gone into is paperless files. The ability to be able to go through large volumes of information, to be able to amass large volumes of information, and then be able to collect that. The next step there after that was going to be, well, how do we actually use that information? And so we have a number of systems in place for data analysis and also for data-driven decisions. And so what we have, one of the things we have is our enterprise data warehouse within the TWC that's allowing us to coagulate a lot of different factors so we can see where there's trends and then try to basically utilize and put resources and time and energy where we can actually make results. One of the things that was helpful, I think, in the past with HUD, they used to have in HIMSS, you could actually generate a heat map. So we could see by zip code across the state of Texas where complaints had been filed. So it gave us a couple of indications. One, we could see where people really knew about fair housing laws and they were active in filing. But at the same time, we could also see where there were deserts where, I mean, because you can't convince me that there's no fair housing violations that don't exist in the valley, but we would receive zero. And so we understood that there were issues there. So one of the things that we want to make sure we're doing is being able to, one, appreciate the data that we do have, then to be able to look at that data and then be able to use it in ways that help us to make good, smart, data-driven decisions. A good portion of that is AI, and no good presentation is ever good any day without saying AI, at least. I think everybody's talking about it because two things. One, it's very powerful, and then two, I think it's probably going to change the world. It may be as impactful as the little hand computers that we have that are actually more powerful than the ones that got Apollo on the moon. But one of the things we've done is, and we've looked at is, any type of the common processes that we have, we've tried to utilize AI so we can help drive faster engagement, more efficient engagement, and keep the human in the loop and more concentrated on the things that humans uniquely can do. So I think that's one of the good things about AI. But I think we're also acutely aware that AI can be, in many cases, sometimes destructive. So we want to look at making sure that people aren't utilizing AI in ways that are bad, that we don't have systemic biases built into the AI, and that it's creating issues on that account. And then ultimately, that we're going to use this AI to, at some point, to help us conduct sort of multivariate analyses that we could only guess about in the past. So we have not been able to tie together what we have to, and we need to, the employment outcomes, the environmental effects and outcomes with the housing and educational outcomes. All these things all have to come together, and we have to have an understanding of that, what that is, and AI can help us do that.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways you could go with this question. One of the things that I'll probably stretch the answer a little bit is social media, and it's become kind of an integral part of a lot of the investigations that we do, and we've got some stuff where we're looking at things that are showing up on like Facebook or Twitter or whatever. I forget what your neighbor app, whatever that one's called. Or TikTok, yeah, TikTok videos. It does, I don't get on social media that much anymore. But, yeah, so that it does raise other questions though, I mean, in terms of like your data collection, your ability to legally collect that evidence, and it's raised in terms of the department. It's kind of opened our eyes too that there's this whole other process that we've got to follow in order to collect stuff like off of a Facebook in terms of that evidence, and then how do we use it, and then so it's a great way, I always like to think in terms of an advocate, since that's really where I'm rooted, is, your clients is get them to sit down with you, get them to take you onto the Facebook pages where they are seeing these things, and capture that stuff with them there, and have them actually do it as opposed to you doing it kind of, in secret. There's a few reasons for that, but I think probably the most important one is once you file that complaint with HUD or TWC or whoever you're going to file it with, most of these respondents will go back and delete a lot of that. And while we say, everything's on the internet forever, we're finding out it's not always on the internet forever. And so, so that's one thing that I would put out there. But in terms of just the kind of the broader transition into AI, or just this using technology, when I was an investigator for HUD, we went through case files. Like we'd drive to a property, show up. They know we were coming. We never just showed up by surprise. And, they put us in a file room and we'd go through tenant files, or we'd go through unit files, and we'd have to build tables to do comparables of, if we were looking at people that got evicted, how many lease, how long did they live there? How many lease infractions did they have? What were the types of lease infractions? And now all of that stuff is in automated, paperless management systems. And so, that data is more readily available to us. It in some ways makes it easier to do the job, but then it also creates other new issues. And so one of the things that we see, like, for instance, if we're looking at application processes and people are being denied for criminal history, is, trying to unravel, who's actually making the decision, because nobody wants to own up that they actually made the decision. They blame the app. The creator's like, no, they have a menu that they can pick from in terms of, what we'll, in terms of how we'll evaluate the applicants, and then it's up to them. And so the technology is great, but it does create new challenges for us.
It's a funny question for me. While I'm sitting up here, Victoria, you've got your notes on your phone. Brian, looks like you're doing the same thing. I'm stuck in 1994, apparently, with my legal pad. But I'll talk technology. We used to say very frequently that race discrimination, national origin discrimination, those types of cases are a lot harder these days, because people know not to say what they shouldn't say in those contexts. Disability, they still are just blatant. Familial status, they're still blatant. Housing providers are, but not so much race and gender and national origin. But you know what? Text messages. I think people think that when you write something on a text, it just like goes to your friend and it will never go anywhere else. It's actually not true. Right? It's amazing how much we can download off of people's text messages beyond anything else, beyond the email, beyond the Facebook Messenger exchanges. Text messages is just like is a free zone, I think people think, and they say some stupid stuff on there, and they say what they actually think. And so some of those cases that a long time ago you say, oh, you'll never get the blatant racial statement, I didn't rent to that person because they're black, but you actually get them in text messages. So the ability to gather that stuff and download it, and with the litigation management and document management systems, we have to search everything. You're getting some pretty wild statements from people now through text messages. So I think that is significant. Right? You can't get off a panel like this without saying AI, or each one of us saying AI. AI, I think, right? It's a misnomer, right? The machine's not actually intelligent, right? The machine is actually copying what we do. And that scares me a little bit. Like, what is the machine reading? Whose information is it reading, right? Is it actually everybody, or are there, segments of the population that's looking at to start creating its patterns, and its way of speaking? And so it is going to AI is going to create a norm that probably is not going to reflect all of us, right? Because it hasn't thought about all of us, or it hasn't looked at what all of us do and how all of us think and write and talk, but it's going to mimic the norm. And yeah, I think some of these patterns that we see and we've been talking about all day are going to get reflected in AI, because it's not an independent thinker. It's going to do things that are fair and equitable. It's going to copy. That might not be what we want.
Right, sort of how Brian touched on earlier with it's a systemic issue and it's been going on. And so if AI is getting its information from laws, that are very outdated or, still have those systemic problems in it, that's what it's going to learn.
And I would note two things. One is that we do have a use case. I'll talk about that in a second. But first is that the AI is generally not divorced from replicating what human beings are and do. So the systemic racism, the systemic disadvantages that have been imposed upon those that have been differently able or different color, nationality, all those things that those systemic disadvantages that have been imposed, they're showing up again. They're just replicated through the technology. So the technology is just a different medium for the same sorts of effects. So I think that's important to recognize. I think the other thing that's important to recognize is that a lot of people are relying on this technology and are thinking that it's going to provide them with some sort of advantage or some way to somehow rectify the situation overnight. It probably won't. I think I was reading some statistics that said about 66% of people thought that what was on the internet was true. But that's just not the case. There's a lot of disinformation, a lot of misinformation. So we had to be careful.
Everything I said before, I just got that off the internet, so Brian said it's not accurate.
I don't know if that's true or not. But the point is when we're talking about the large language models and what's the norm, the people that are using the internet, the people that have access to high-speed internet and that are that have been utilizing computer systems, those are the ones setting the norm. That was probably not those that are in impoverished or disadvantaged neighborhoods.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I'll go to the use case now, but just recognizing that that's kind of where we're at. The use case we're trying to really focus on is how do we utilize the technology, the robotics, the automation, so it surrounds the human being. We don't want to take the humans out of the loop. We want to make them sort of more like Superman or Superwoman. We'll put the S on the chest. We want them to still be able to do their job, but to be able to do their job more efficiently so they can be able to reach more folks a little quicker, maybe a little bit better. So one of the things we've done is we're utilizing transcription services when we're in the intake or the investigation stage, so that you can actually engage in an interview without actually having to have a piece of paper and a pad. No offense to read, but we want people to be efficiently able to have that conversation and then dynamically be able to record what's there. And then also to be able to comply with our HUD overlords, so to speak, we need to be able to summarize that to a narrative. There are requirements that we have to process these cases, but we want to be able to summarize the conversation, to be able to do that rapidly, and also be able to put that into a narrative so we can put it in hymns. But nonetheless, these are things that help in a very common basic task. And so we're going to continue to look for places where common basic tasks can be assisted and aided by technology. There's some additional, higher level functional skills that we'd like to get to, but I think that most of those right now are a little bit more pie in the sky, and there is still some latent, if not overt, danger that the systems may end up engendering discrimination that we're already trying to fight against.
Okay, and so what are some ways that fair housing laws can be strengthened or improved to better protect vulnerable, populations and try and prevent more discrimination in housing?
Sure. You guys just enforce what's there, right? No, I mean, I really do think that this concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing is really at the root of what needs to be improved. And that's assuming we get back what has been rolled back. So thinking about looking forward, affirmatively furthering is a really critical thing. And then, affirmatively furthering, I don't talk about it just in the sort of narrow concept of as it appears in the Fair Housing Act, but just as an approach, right? We are going to see these systemic problems, figure out solutions. If that requires consideration of race, fine. If that requires consideration of ethnicity, fine. Let's fix these problems that we have created with hundreds of years of segregation and discrimination. And it's going to take a long time, and there's going to have to be a real commitment to it. But that's what has to happen as you look at it on the long view. In the short view, yeah, I mean, we've got it. Our fair housing laws are being chipped away. Chipped is probably the wrong word. They're being chunked away. And what we could do 10 years ago, some of those things we can't do today, which is a little horrifying that we're going in the wrong direction in that sense. So that sort of advocacy to our legislators to make sure that we preserve what is clearly there, what has been there since 1968. That's absolutely critical, and that's got to happen tomorrow. And then at the same time, but with a longer view, is like let's turn this into an affirmative concept, an affirmative statute, and really right the wrongs that have been visited against our communities for so long.
Yeah, that's always a tricky question for us because of the policy parts of it, and not really supposed to speak to policy. So I think as an institution, I think it's probably the most important thing for FHEO or maybe any government agency is to be able to change more quickly. And if there's anything that I've learned about bureaucracy is it's very slow to change, and that makes it really challenging to keep up with the evolving case law, the new ways that we see discrimination happen. And it's the same old discrimination, it just presents itself in new ways. And then, I think just if there was any hope, it's of all the things that we experienced, like during COVID as an agency, is we did show that we can change, and we changed a lot of the ways that we do business. But we need to be guarded against getting lazy now that we're kind of settling into a routine, and we've got to be willing to continue to change.
I think one of the things that I said earlier, I still stand by, is that I said the law is not enough. And partly that's because the law is continually being interpreted, and it's interpreted by those that are in power. And the determination of who's in power really is determined by who votes, who has the sort of the gold. I think the old saying is that who has the gold, who has the might. And so one of the things I think we want to do is to continue to encourage groups to collaborate together, to work together, to find common sources of strength and common efforts where we can combine knowledge bases, where people can become educated, provide training and technical assistance. In many cases, what we're really trying to do is we recognize that we only have about 60 people in our division, but there's millions of people out there that could be subject to discrimination at any point in time. We're going to try to get ahead of that. I think that's one of the things that we want to do. And at the same time, we also want to protect from the erosion of the fair housing laws that are out there, And I think a lot of that's going to occur not necessarily through just putting more laws in place, but actually through some real community engagements, talking to people, getting understanding of what the laws do, how they work for people, and then ensuring that people are actually standing up and advocating for their fair housing rights.
So Reed had touched on, in the Fifth Circuit, and he's, coming at it at the litigation side, right? When a case is already to that point, and that standing is a big issue there. Is there an issue or a couple of issues that you see coming up a lot in cases, when you're getting them in, that are preventing you from being able to pursue it further? You talked about sort of a small percentage of the intake that you get actually ends up being pursued. Is there things that, the community stakeholders, that people who are bringing these claims can do maybe a little bit better to help them be able to, if it gets to litigation, have a good case?
I'm going to tap in first for a change. Coming from the advocacy side and then being on the HUD side of things, it's when I go out and talk to our FIP partners about the work I see that they're doing, is always, and it's a hard mindset if you're not necessarily in litigation or have a background in litigation, is you have to think about each of these clients that come in is a case that might be in court at some point. And so on the housing end of it, what we see happen a lot of times is a client will go into the FIP, they have a lot of papers with them, a lot of documentation, they do an interview, the FIP takes a statement, gets it signed, and they send it in. But there was no preservation of the documents that the tenant or the client has brought in with them. And, it makes it through HUD intake, makes its way to either, one of our investigators or maybe a FAP agency. And by the time we are able to track down the complainant, they've lost all those documents. And maybe their cell phone been turned off, maybe it's been lost, they've got a new cell phone, so all those text messages that they're telling us about don't exist anymore. Anything that they had printed, their journals, their notes, if they've become homeless, some of those documents are lost. And so from where I sit, if there was anything I could encourage y'all to do is to document the heck out of everything and think, this case could land in litigation. And if it does, these are the documents that, we started out with, and we're going to want to preserve those.
I think I'd reflect back a little bit on awareness. I was doing a presentation just last week for the Austin Mortgage Bankers Association. And so I started talking about ESAs. And surprisingly, most of them had never had an actual full fair housing training program. And so I got questions for about 30 minutes on, and they said, well, can you come back and do some more? I said, we'll have to come back another time. But the reality is that we have a lot of entities, whether that is mortgagers or loan officers or people in real estate, some HOAs, I think I mentioned earlier, that do not have a good awareness of what fair housing laws are. That extends down to our stakeholders and some of the customers that we're going to have. They don't know where to go. They don't know what to file. They're not keeping records and documentation. So by the time they do get to us, we do situations where there's a lack of evidence to substantiate. We can call it factual sufficiency, because we have to have facts sufficient to support the legal allegations. Or sometimes they get to us too late, in which case we don't have jurisdiction to initiate a case. And so those are the challenges that we really see.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes, I think, left in our time. And so if anybody has any questions, you can feel free to come up to the mics or, just shout them out. But in the meantime, are there any, parting thoughts you have about, any maybe any, positive outlooks going forward.
If I could go a bit extant, I do want to thank my team for being here, HUD, and all our federal partners in the work that everybody's done in this work. This is a hard work. This is, in many cases, a thankless work, but it is very important work. And so what I want to acknowledge is that the work that's really being accomplished successfully, diligently, and that's lasting is work that's being done in partnership with others. So we want to thank our partners at TDHCA, the Appraisal Board for Texas, the Texas Realtors, I think the ATA, the Appraisal Texas Association, and others, many, many others that we're working with to provide presentations, technical assistance. They're asking us questions, asking us to engage, and we're looking for more partners. We want to continue to partner at each and every stage and every time we can with those that are interested and have a connection to fair housing.
Yeah, I'm going to leave with a smile now. No, seriously, I think in terms of just looking forward, I agree with Brian. It really does come down to a team. I mean, even the stuff that happens at HUD that nobody ever sees is, there's Office of Counsel, there's other program offices that we're working in concert with. If we've got issues involving like voucher holders or somebody that's living in a multifamily property, of course, then most importantly, a lot of times these cases are brought to us by our FIT partners or other advocacy groups that often work with us. And so, without them, a lot of this, without you, a lot of this goes unnoticed. And so, it's important that you, even if we frustrate you to the nth degree, which I'm sure we do at times, just keep beating on our door. Eventually we do answer. And hopefully sometimes those answers are big.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reason and a lot of basis for optimism. There all the advocates in this room, and these rooms all across the country, HUD, DOJ, the local FAPs and FIPS, community advocates, are making noise and trying to improve the situation in housing throughout the country. So yeah, it'll always be a battle. It'll always be pushing against a tide that at times will seem insurmountable. But we've been through these periods in the past where there have been rollbacks of our civil rights protections, and we fought through and had stronger protections on the backside. And so I'm hopeful it happens. It's just we have to just be aware of what is happening right now, and it's a little bit of a crisis in terms of what is happening to the tools that are so important to be able to maintain equity in housing.
Okay, it looks like we have a question here.
Just yell.
Yeah, you could just shout it out. Well,
Is there any current movement or class action suit in considering people's rent that's being included in property taxes, and so that people can, in post having paid these rent monies that have paid property taxes with their rent, be recompensated in ownership of the property that they paid to? Is that a class action thing that's going on right now? Or is it an activist movement that anybody here might know about that where the community at large can go and gather around?
I don't know of any such case and haven't really heard about any advocacy around it. So I'm not aware of it, but that doesn't mean a ton.
No awareness on my part.
But just for clarification, is it not true that a portion of every one person who's paying rent is actually paying in proportionality to property taxes?
that their monies are being accumulated for perspective of being applied to property taxes, which is ownership of the land.
Yeah, but I think you could say that about any sort of income, right? Like, so anytime you are paying somebody who is a property owner, right, that money they're getting, whether it's, you know, for whatever you're paying them for, right, they may decide to have that pay their property taxes. So I don't know that that would give you a stake. I don't know what the sort of legal basis would be for that giving you a stake in their property, since you have helped fund them.
It seems to me like there's a portion of the expectation of how these properties are being developed that's actually assuming our tax dollars that we've spent without really the full consideration of who's all going to be appropriated into it, and then not being returned investment. They're not getting a return on the ROI for their investment. And so how to better credit everybody who's paying rent, a resourceful action towards land ownership and staying in a permanent location instead of assuming rent, which is basically enabling everybody to move around the country. That's where its origin came from, is move around to wherever the work was. Now that we have the ability to go to work all over the world from a singular location, it seems more sensible to go and own land in an area, and so therefore be rewarded for our investment. And that's the only reason I bring it up. The other, I'm sorry, there was one other thing I was going to hope to ask and stuff. Oh my God, nope, it's gone. And thank you very much for hearing me out.
Thank you. We have another question over here. Yes.
Yeah, just to dovetail on the tenants' rights, can you speak to right to counsel that's happened in Houston, San Antonio, why Austin hasn't moved forward with right to counsel in eviction cases? So I'm talking about renters, and I know that Houston and San Antonio have partnered up, have received federal money so that everyone facing eviction has an attorney to represent them in the eviction course. And the statistics show not only disparity in eviction cases filed, but then also the results that are transversed. When you're represented by an attorney, you're likely to win 80% of the time, whereas if you're not, you lose 80% of the time. Can you all speak to movement about that? And then also, I think something, if you have time, affordable housing can be on the legislative agenda this next session. If you might speak to what we might be able to rally behind, that's being talked about this coming up.
I don't think HUD can't take a position on either of those, but personally, I think the right to counsel is incredibly important for the reasons that you've touched on. I think there was a law professor in Arkansas that was tracking those results, and it's pretty profound. And so, yeah, I'm more than happy to support it.
We're much the same way. We wouldn't take a position on or lobby behind any particular situation, but we are. I mean, I think people are generally aware that housing in Texas is pretty expensive. If you've bought a house in the last few years, the prices are pretty high, interest rates are very high, and taxes are high. So there's not a lot of relief anywhere. Certainly, I think it doesn't preclude others from getting together as a community group and finding some common proposals that they'd like to present to their legislators and hopefully get passed.
Yeah, I think Reed touched on that in his keynote with a question from the audience about, how can we get these things changed? And, I think a lot of it does go to these community advocates and the collaboration and making your voice heard and getting other groups along with you to bring that, and making sure you're voting for the people that are going to effectuate those changes, and going to county commissioners meetings, going to city council meetings, and letting them know that these are important things to you, and so that they can see, this has community support. This is something that we obviously need, and they can, get moving on that. But I think it is going to a lot of the times, because like they're saying, as HUD, as TWC, as the city, we can't, do one thing or the other. But if you're making your voices heard and advocating for that, it definitely can do change. So I think that we are out of time at this point. Can we do this one more question? Okay, you've been up there for a while, so we'll go ahead and do one more.
Good afternoon. My question has to do with the discrimination of seniors who are of color. Now, we're both minority on both sides. And the Office of HUD really has done nothing for us. And I'm sorry, Mr. Bannis, but we've got 3 different cases at the HUD office right now. And we were sent to lawyer referral. Lawyer referral didn't do a single thing. I'm still waiting to hear from them. And it's happening to more senior citizens than just myself. I'm about to be homeless because I have a landlord who is not from this country, and I applied for another house from someone who also is not from this country, who took $8,000 of a $10,000 deposit he charged me, and I don't know what recourse we had because nothing's being done. I appreciate all of you being here today, but I sat here and I didn't really hear any solutions to anything. All I heard was what we already know, what we're living right now. Are there any solutions to these things? Any real solutions? Tangible solutions that we can actually go out and put our hands on, or go out and get someone to represent us. Because everything you all said, we know. I just don't know what an Article 5 is, but I'll look it up. So the thing is, we need more advocacy, more work to be done for minorities, whether they're Black, whatever, old, young, disabled. And that's not happening very rapidly based on other things going on in the world.
Yeah. Let me just say, I'm going to start by saying I'm sorry. I know I don't like to hear about what might be a customer service issue on our end. And so without knowing a lot more about the situation, it's hard to give you a very good answer. But there's 2 people in this room that I'd like you to talk to. One of them works for me, and the other one does not, but he works in legal services. I'm hoping he'll humor me. I'm kind of looking at his direction.
I have all my paperwork too.
And so maybe we can talk afterwards and see what we can do.
All right then. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right, well, thank you, and thank you to our panel and to everybody for being here.
Thanks.